Good afternoon, everybody. I'll just talk for a few seconds to warm you all up. It's just after lunch. I guess you're still digesting your lunch. My name is Lee Hibbard. I'm from the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, and I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you very much to the OSCE, to Dunja Mijatovic for this invitation to moderate. And we'll, with a great team of panelists, we'll talk with today. Just a few words about myself before we start in framing this discussion. And just to say thank you to Emily for the remote. We have remote participation, so I hope that we can bring that in the course of the discussions. Discussions like this, for me, should be very multi-stakeholder. So I'm looking for different stakeholders in the room to discuss. It should be very interactive. So we don't have any set presentations. It's going to be try to be very fluid. So we have Anya, who has a roaming microphone. So please jump in. Let's make it as interactive as possible. Say your names. I would really like to have a debate or discussion between us, not from here to there. So I work in Strasbourg, and my office is not very far away from the European Court of Human Rights. Dawn, the keynote speaker this morning, mentioned that and the US Constitution's First Amendment and the ICCPR regarding freedom of expression, and the scalpel and the sledgehammer issues regarding due diligence. And I'm often looking at the case law of the Court of Human Rights regarding Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, for the right to freedom of expression, to seek, to impart and receive information regardless of frontiers, etc. And so the new dimension now is internet, and there are cases trickling through the court more and more regarding the internet. So it's quite clear the trickle will become an estuary very soon. Regarding due diligence and process, it's clear that there are cases involving procedures, and there was a case involving Ukraine and journalists quite recently where there was no legislation in place regarding journalists in Ukraine, and the public watchdog function was an issue in Ukraine, and so they accessed content online, and there was a question of defamation. And it was a question of procedure, but the court came down in favor of there being freedom of expression, protecting the journalists online, and using the internet as part of their media watchdog function. So that was a procedure which hit upon a really important right, the right we're talking about today. But there are questions of content. There was a case several years ago regarding a website involving extreme pornography and the question of children's protection. And there we go towards questions of morals and the role of the state, and the role of the state to guarantee and protect, which is the top line of the European Convention on Human Rights. We've said it many times, I'll say it again, that freedom of expression is a cornerstone of any democratic society to curb power and to prevent abuse. That's the reasons. We see cases, as mentioned before, London riots, the question of social unrest and the use of technology and the grey area in that regard. We see other countries like Azerbaijan and journalists and the mobilization of journalists using technologies. Not an easy situation, also in the Council of Europe. So how can we protect and guarantee freedom of expression online? That's the issue. This session is not about hate speech, because hate speech is next door in another room. So we're talking about things which are a lot to do with insult and offensive words which may not constitute hate speech. So if you think you're in the wrong room, then it's time to change rooms. So there's been a trend in terms of what we understand about freedom of expression online. The Human Rights Council last year in July made a resolution which said that freedom of expression applies online as it does offline. Very important at a global level, which I think hopefully should be followed up. We see national courts looking at these issues too. A prisoner in the UK being denied access to the internet for freedom of expression purposes. It was appealed, and the prisoner was given access. So even in prison, access to the internet is important. The German Supreme Court has just ruled on the rights for users to access the internet and to appeal against their ISP to make sure they have access. So we see a real a move towards access to the internet being a really fundamental right. This morning, Dawn mentioned a case of Yildirim, which is a case which, for the first time, said that involving Turkey, whereby there was a blanket blocking of a Google sites, which led to a violation of freedom of expression of that person in particular. So that's the first time that you see a real linking of an article of the Convention of Human Rights and the internet, not as a procedure, but in terms of real content. And it's quite exciting to see that happen. So that, for me, was a seminal case and a flagship for the future. So this is where we're going. We also see the foreign policies of several governments. I've got two sitting next to me, the US and Sweden, but not just, the Netherlands too, whereby freedom of expression, internet freedom, although internet freedom may be slightly different to freedom of expression, it's much more, I would posit, is a priority, a foreign policy priority for member states. And I'd like to explore that as well. The safety of online media actors, for example, some of us met in the IGF in Baku last year, including Dunja Mijatovic and others, and Nelly Cruz, the Commissioner, and our own Commissioner of Human Rights, Nils Muiznieks, to talk about the online safety of media actors. So it's quite clear that, you know, it's a hot topic, freedom online, internet freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of the media online. I think it can be agreed that respect for equal dignity of all human beings is key. The question of respect, when we talk about insult and hurtful and hateful comments, which are not necessarily hate speech, I think we can all agree that, you know, when there is violence and there is real hatred which is actually expressed, so we're going from words to actions, that we condemn the violence and incitement to hatred, of course. But we're going to take a step back from that. And I think we can recall that, you know, freedom of expression might offend, shock, or disturb another person. But that, in one particular very famous case of the Court of Human Rights, is part of the needs of pluralism, broad-mindedness, and tolerance in democratic societies. So, you know, we have to bear in mind the sensitivities of other religions, etc., and other groups, denominations, but nevertheless, we also have to be ready to take something, the flak, I think, in terms of criticisms. So there's a very interesting, nice little quote I came across when I was thinking about this session, which is that freedom only to speak inoffensively is not worth having, said Stephen Sedley, a UK senior judge some years ago, in terms of, you know, freedom to shock, offend, or disturb. States have a job to protect people, to guarantee rights and freedoms, to ensure that there is media freedom. And we're moving towards a question of bloggers and other actors communicating in the public interest. So I think media online is also going towards bloggers and those who are not necessarily defined as properly as media. And states have the right to protect others, other people. The question of defamation will come to, other people's rights and reputations. That's also something to consider, something which they have as part of their duty. So it's this balanced approach. Limits, rights, and responsibilities is part of the title of this session. So before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to put this into context, why we're here. I think one of the reasons why we have this session is because of recent abuses of freedom online. Think about the video clip, Innocence of Muslims, and what that produced in terms of discussion, debate. We could think about cases involving, for example, in Hungary, and the question of anti-Roma sentiment, and one particular founding member of a political party saying very not nice things about Roma people in Hungary. We could talk about Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, and the website which was opened to give complaints regarding Central and Eastern European workers, which is a form of expression which, you know, again, teeters on the edge of what we're talking about, hate speech and also, you know, offensive words. We can think about Twitter, the recent Twitter case in France, and anti-Semitic words and comments being made. And we could even talk about criminal social media abuse in the UK and the way they've just done a consultation regarding, you know, criminal expression which is sustained hatred, which could lead to harassment, and which is really quite sustained and hateful, compared to other content, other comments, which is less, maybe you say something nasty about somebody, but it stops there. So different types of offences being thought about in the UK regarding social media abuse online. So distinguishing hate speech from the perception of hate speech in terms of words and insults is important. Distinguishing between genuine and serious incitement to extremism from the rights of individuals to express their views. Distinguishing words from actions. I think that's the things, these are the contextual things I'd like to mention. So what are the limits, what are the perceptions? And at the end of this session, we have to go towards some recommendations for the OSCE and some sort of wrap-up, and so I'd like us to think about those too. You know, where is online free speech heading, in your opinion? Is there a default setting for internet freedom to offend, shock, and disturb? Do we have a baseline for freedom online and for the protection of intermediaries, for companies, etc.? And you know, how can Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights be enshrined in regulatory practices on online media? So I'm going to stop there, but I'm just going to now introduce the panelists. It's a great bunch of panelists. And I'll do it in alphabetical order. We have Daniel Barefoot, Deputy Assistant Secretary, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in the State Department in the United States. Very much on the scene in terms of internet freedom issues. I see you a lot in different conferences, so he must be important.
Or idle.
Or idle, well, I doubt that. To my right, we have Olof Ehrenkrona, who is Senior Advisor to the Swedish Foreign Affairs Minister, Carl Bildt, and I see you a lot too, Olof, so that must mean something. We have, where's Miklos Harashti, who is, I must get the title right, the former OSCE representative on freedom of the media, and now serving as a UN independent expert on human rights. Miklos, lots of things to say, I'm sure. We have Janez next to him, Janez Lenacic, Director of ODIHR, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. And we have Marco Pancini, yes, to my right, Senior Policy Counsel at Google, and I see you a lot too, so that means something. And I see we have a change, a last-minute change for the Human Rights Ambassador, Mr. Veer. We have Davy van der Weerd, who is Deputy Head of the Human Rights Department in the Netherlands. So thank you for taking his place at the last minute. First question, and I really want to stop talking. So can we really legislate at the national level about respect for people's morals on the internet? Or should we just leave online expression alone, let it flow? I mean, is it something we can really legislate respect? This very scalpel approach to deciding what's sensitive, what's insulting, etc. And I'd like to, first of all, turn to the government's colleagues, to Olof perhaps, to Daniel. But I mean, it's open, it's also to you. Can we really legislate about people's morals on the internet? It's something that can be really achievable. Olof.
I think basically you should be very cautious when you're legislating about morals. It usually backfires. But I think it's good to have the distinction between procedure and content. I think that is important. I fully agree what was said about the procedure before in the morning session, but let's talk about content then for a couple of minutes, because the freedom of expression is the core for an open society, and it's the most important base for democracy. I mean, it's absolutely impossible to have a democracy if you don't have freedom of speech. And this, in some countries, including my own, this means that freedom of speech as a part of the political conversation, as a part of the political debate, is absolutely essential. And it has a stronger protection than freedom of speech in general. And I think that is basically a quite valid approach. But so the media in my country is in a sphere of that has a special protected, it's a special protected area within this framework. And you can say things about politicians that you're not allowed to say to ordinary citizens. I think that is basically good. I was called Sancho Panza on the net yesterday. I think that was perfectly all right. Of course, I confronted the person who said it, and he immediately excused himself and said he didn't mean that at all, because he did not know that he was seen, actually. But I believe that it's important to recognize that there is a sphere with you where you should not be able to insult people. But I would also like to say that this is a difficult thing to actually use the scalpel on, because we had a discussion after 1968 when people started to criticize the business. We got a discussion, can you defame a company? Can you insult a company? And should you actually be convicted to pay a fine if you and if I compare US with Sweden, for example, we are, it's almost impossible for a company in Sweden to become to get money from a private person who criticizes in the media. While I have a friend in US who happens to work at the Peterson Institute, and he was not able to publish a book about, or a part of a book about an oligarch in Ukraine, because it was seen as a violation of his reputation in the American court. So he had to withdraw this. And of course, this would never happen if he had published a book in Sweden. And from my point of view, I think it's better that you get the companies to hire PR consultants and hire people in information departments protecting the company's reputation in an open debate than in the courts. So I prefer here to have a very, very narrow space for libels. With regard to what I'm allowed to say as a private person, I think one should be aware of the fact that one consequence of opening up the public sphere, as you do with the internet, is that if you prohibit ordinary people to say things that is allowed by journalists, sooner or later the legitimacy for the media to have a tough language towards politicians will be limited. Because people will, the ordinary citizens will say, why can the journalists say things that I am not allowed to say? So when you open the public sphere as you do within the internet, I think that instead of having the gut reaction that you need to regulate more, I would say you need probably to have the opposite reaction. You must understand that people, ordinary people, are taking part in the public debate in a way that they were not allowed to do or had the possibilities to do then. And then they will say things that seems sometimes quite brutal. To a certain extent, you have to accept it, and you have to find other means for people to civilize the political conversation. One good thing is, of course, to bring up your children, telling them that there are things that you don't say to anyone else. Or having this as a part of the curriculum in the schools. How do you actually act on the internet in a way that you don't harass people or that you don't violate people's dignity?
So, thank you, Olaf. So you're saying that we shouldn't legislate about people's morals, and you're saying that we should sort of leave online expression alone. While you're thinking about that, let me ask Dan. You know, it's a different, freedom of expression is different in the US compared to, let's say, in a pan-European context. Freedom of expression in the US is dealt with differently. It was mentioned this morning compared to, say, in a pan-European context. Internet freedom is a driving policy agenda item for the former Secretary of State Clinton, and some of the very good speeches she's made. I'd like to ask you, Dan, what do you think about, should we leave online expression alone? Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Dunja, for inviting me and such a great group of panelists to discuss this with, and I hope that we will turn to the audience soon. So I agree with Olaf. Kind of the topic for this conversation is, well, we had a very good presentation on the procedural norms and the convergence of procedural norms. The question in this conversation seems to be more about the substantive norms in terms of whether or not there should be restrictions. And I think procedurally, the United States takes a view that is quite similar to many other OSCE member states, although there are some member states who demonstrate a commitment to democratic, transparent processes of regulation less than others. I think substantively, the United States is widely recognized as taking a position that substantively there's very little that ought to be restricted. We do have civil defamation, the possibility for civil defamation cases, but not for public figures. As President Obama said in his General Assembly address this year, he gets criticized online every day, and there's no protection for that, and public figures should expect that. Although I wouldn't call Olaf Hansa, at least not in front of him. And the restrictions on speech, you know, incitement to imminent violence is a very high threshold in the United States in jurisprudence. It requires the intention, it requires the actual possibility, and it requires it to be imminent. And those are, the combination of those three factors make incitement to imminent violence a very high threshold. I'd like to just comment on kind of two things that I think get missed, or three things, I guess, that get missed often in the conversation about what should or whether things should be prohibited. At the outset, I'll say that I was alarmed to hear you, Lee, use the term abuse of freedom online. I think abuse of freedom online is a term that is usually used by those who don't support freedom online. I think it's far more often that we see abuses of restrictions online than abuse of anything that should be called abuse of freedom. I think that what happens usually in this conversation is that people start by picking out something that we can all agree we wish didn't exist, like hateful speech, or something that harms people, or offends them, or something that we find disgusting or repulsive or morally repugnant. And they choose the easiest thing to agree on. And then they make a logical leap that we can eliminate that through legislation, which is the first leap. And then they import more things into the category of what's bad, and then you get an ever-widening scope of what gets restricted, including usually that second step includes widening what's bad to be anything that causes social instability or challenge the political status quo. And there's a good deal of, arguably most of human progress that would not have existed, would not have ever come to pass had we always banned things that were deemed offensive by somebody, particularly those in power. And so I think there's this progression that we see time and time again, where you start with something where you can really get most people to agree that's really bad. We would like the world better if it didn't exist. And then you make the logical leap that we can get rid of it by banning it. And then you broaden the category and it becomes more and more repressive. I think that first leap is one that we need to challenge. So with the idea of things that we might all in this room agree are offensive. One is the question, empirically, can you eliminate that by legislating? And there is no evidence that you can. It is a false argument. I challenge those who think that banning speech solves the problem to produce one case where there's a society where banning speech has eliminated the thing that it was meant to eliminate. In Western Europe, banning Nazi speech does not eliminate neo-Nazism. It hasn't. Arguably, in many places, it's actually made it more sensational and has been, at least not causally, but empirically, it's been associated at the same time period as a rise in neo-Nazism or anti-Semitism in some places. So it doesn't solve the problem. There was a recent study done by the Pew Foundation in a variety of societies, not just in the OSCE region, that found that the more speech was restricted, the higher social hostility between different groups went. So I think it's really important that we challenge the empirical, because if it doesn't work, it certainly shouldn't be public policy. Even if we agree that the world would be better without certain kinds of expression, if it doesn't work, then it shouldn't be justified as public policy. The second is, I think, a theoretical piece that attaches to our underlying belief and the commitments that underlie Helsinki, but the commitment to fundamental freedoms, which is that I think banning speech takes power away from the audience by mixing it with authority. And one of the things that when people look at American society, where there is offensive speech that happens every day, sometimes people wonder, why don't Americans, even those who are the targets of the offensive speech, why don't they get more upset? Why don't they ask the government more often to ban it, et cetera. And there's an acceptance, I think, because there are so few restrictions on expression in the United States, there's an acceptance that expression has to stand or fall on its own merits. Nobody sees it as being mixed with authority. It hasn't been sanctioned by power. If it doesn't make sense, if it can't stand on its own merits, it will fall away. And there's therefore, in contrast, in some of the societies with the most restrictions on speech, it has been mixed with authority. Yes, there's speech that's prohibited, but by implication, any speech that's then allowed has been sanctioned by authority, and therefore people have very strong complaints against authorities because when that speech appears. And I think by opening that door, you go into a period, you go down a slippery slope where you have to restrict more and more and more until only puppy dogs and rainbows are the only things left that anybody can talk about, because everything else somebody finds offensive and it has been mixed with authority, and so people challenge it. And I think, you know, what you do by prohibiting speech, by mixing authority with speech, is you put the power to determine whether speech has merit into the power of the government, instead of putting it into the power of the audience, into the power of the general public, who can choose to believe or not to believe, to reject or not to reject, to respond to and argue with or not to argue with themselves, where the marketplace is left and where ideas or expression has to rise or fall on its own merits rather than on the power of the government.
Thank you very much. So leaving expression alone, and I'm going to come to Miklas, but I'd like to cue up Marco from Google to ask about you know, companies and their editorial policies and codes of conduct. Should they be left alone in terms of their interpretations? But before we get there, Marco, Milos, you wanted to come in.
Daniel basically spoke about democracies, about jurisprudence, or whether it is prudent to legislate separately about online expression in democracy. But the hard fact of life is that in countries which he characterized as less keen on rule of law, democracy, the reason why legislation comes to mind about online expression is solely because politicians, people in power, don't like online freedom. Social media all over the world, the users of which multiply by the million daily, never ever complained about insulting speech against each other. And this brings to my mind a deeper question. So why is this happening, and what should we think about the reason of the don't do? Why don't do it? Not just because you please be more democratic. That's shallow. There is something about internet expression, internet online media itself, which needs to be clarified, and which is almost artificially remains murky in the heads of those who do this. Namely, the funny tool to do the restriction is to equate online media with all other types of media. In many countries of the OSCE, the habit is passing online legislation about online expression by equating it to their otherwise existing categories of media. Now, here is the basic fallacy. Here is the basic fallacy. Why? Because online media is unlike old media for many, many basic reasons, starting with the fact it is global, starting with the fact it is based on hyperlink, which is content behind content behind content, and starting with the fact of the possibility of upload elsewhere and download inside the country. What does that mean? That territorial jurisdiction in the era of internet is virtually over, whatever you do. And we are in a window of understanding. The final understanding will be brought by absolute bandwidth, not by governments, not by movements, but by the fact that the endless bandwidth would arrive when we, in this window of history, very short window, I would give 10 years to it, 10 years. In this short window, governments find it hard to give up territorial control over content. That's the heart of the issue. That they have to, not because the internet is invincible. The sad news is that in this window of history, in this short window of history, you asked, our chair asked, is technical means of control working? Do they work? Unfortunately, they do work, but only selectively, only arbitrarily, and only, as it is always the rule, in a politicized way. And that's what they are using in order to bomb the global media, the internet-based media, back under territorial control, because the global media is deterritorializing control. So the greatest ally of online media freedom is, of course, time. The good news is it's relatively short historically. The bad news is it's very bad for those who would like to express themselves freely online. And the shallow debate about whether, for example, when you see unquestionably more prevalent hate speech or insulting speech online than in the already territorially controlled classic media, then it is, oh yes, because they can put their servers in the US and then they can beam back. But this is a shallow debate given the fact that time will solve it. And my last phrase about it is that while, of course, in democracies, it is simply not possible to totally block media by carving out practically a national internet out of the global internet, like really oppressive countries, China or Iran do. But you have this partial misunderstanding about the character of global media or partial deliberate forgetfulness about the character of global media. Let me give an example. In Hungary, the Constitutional Court has, for all reasons, for all practical and theoretical reasons, has practically abolished categories like defamation of religions. Hungary as a country consistently votes in the Human Rights Council in Geneva against the globalization of defamation of religions. But in Hungary's media law, you have defamation of religions. So this partial mosaic-like oppression trying to bomb it back into under territorial control is the danger for a while.
But Miklas, does this mean legislation, does this mean regulation or not? On that point, let me go to, I'll leave that point open, but Marco, should we leave online companies like Google alone with regard to their editorial policies and codes of conduct regarding freedom of expression and how to decide upon sensitive, hurtful, offensive remarks?
Thank you, Lee, for the question. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about such an important topic. I think at Google we feel the responsibility of our work when it's about to tackling difficult issues like controversial content online. First of all, I want to stress and highlight our approach towards content. The content that we host is to let the content flow. So to have an approach towards the content which is very respectful of the user, very respectful of their right to express their opinion online. There are a couple of things that we need to take in consideration, by the way, in carrying on this activity. First of all, we say that we don't want to be the judge and jury of the content online. We have both terms and conditions of our services, which are the community guidelines, so the rules that the community has decided to give themselves on YouTube, on bloggers, on our social network services of Google+. And on top of that we have the laws. And in respect of these two important points of reference, we take action. But at the same time, we don't want to be left alone in taking action, because we don't believe that simply trust or simply leaving to companies this very delicate work is the right way to avoid abuses. For this reason, we have launched an initiative, now it's a couple of years, called the Transparency Report. Through the Transparency Report, we offer a full overview on our approach towards request of taking down content. YouTube is not included yet, it will be in the future, but for the time being, this is including all our existing platforms. We believe that this is the right way to put the civil society in the position of having all the information that they need in order to understand what kind of approach governments have towards content online, what kind of approach platforms have towards content online, what is the impact of abuses on these. And say that we don't want to repeat the debate that we had this morning, but the due process of law, so the rule of law is very important, especially for what concern government request. Again, we need to open also a debate between the different views that we have in Europe about freedom of expression and the views that we have in US, the views in US culturally, historically, as around freedom of expression. We don't have a First Amendment in Europe. Probably in Europe we have a more big focus on media pluralism. We have a strong focus on the ethical approach towards content. But I think this cannot be considered as a conflict. This has to be considered as a dialogue between two different visions that needs to find a way to live together. Which means that, for example, we found extremely interesting all the ethical debate that we are having in this moment in Brussels around media, around the role of media, around the role of online platforms. Just to mention a couple of things, all the works of the high-level group on media pluralism and the recent On Life manifesto spent a length of time in going through all the possible arguments about what should be the ethical framework when it's about discussing controversial content online. So this gray area of content that can be for somebody harmful, but again is not illegal. So I think we don't have all the answer, but I think it's very important to keep on making us the question, keep on having our a house of glass and be very transparent about our approach towards content. Be not shy in saying that we are confronted to very difficult situations, mentioning the Mohammed case, just to mention one, the Mohammed case, where we were clear that we were put in a very difficult situation. We had to make a decision in a very difficult situation, and we hope that this situation will not happen again in the future. Because again, it's not the role of the intermediaries to be the judge and jury. It's the role of the intermediaries to empower people to express their opinion.
Thank you, Marco. And I'd like to say that regarding the Innocence of Muslims clip, there was a statement made by GNI, the Global Network Initiative, of which Google is one of the members. And it's quite clear that exactly what you say is that there wasn't really one message from the statement made by GNI. It was a series of different comments, because it's a grey area. It's difficult, as you're saying. So I guess that's a call for not being left alone, for actually working together with the governments, actually trying to work out what this sort of content is. I'm very happy that we have our first comment from the floor. I hope it's one of many, because it should be interactive, so please, please. Please, you'd like to say something. Your name first, please.
My name is Ashraf. I'm from the Danish Institute for Human Rights. I'd like to thank Daniel first for his comment on, or challenging for those who mean that legislations could solve the problem. And I would like to ask, even if the solution is legislation, would authority that need to execute such legislation have the capacity to do it? And don't we also might risk that such authority can misuse the implementation of legislation.
Yeah. So if I'm right in thinking that it's, can you really effectively enforce a decision? Given that there's lots of communication online, I mean, there's so much communication, can it really be up to the courts, etc., to really enforce the law in that context? That's what you mean. I'll open that to the floor, but do you want to come on, Miklos, and then we come to the other gentleman? Yes?
Very briefly,
Yes.
As I mentioned, it can really selectively and in a politicized way. Let me add something. Why is this the case? Because the specificity of the internet is that it is not monitorable as old media is. Therefore, a rule of law approach to content restriction is theoretically even not possible in a global media because it's endless. And therefore, you cannot know about every occurrence, therefore you cannot punish every occurrence. So, but the real relationship is reverse. They do these laws in order to be selective and politicized and arbitrary. It doesn't just happen to be arbitrary. They create it for that purpose. So, yes, the answer is it is enforceable, but always with the help of the tool of making fear. It never, basically with legal tools like a media authority, like a court, like a prosecution, it never works simply that. You have to be able to menace those who are picked at for expression with extra-legal punishments or extra-legal consequences in order for those restrictions to work. And then, unfortunately, they do work for a while.
Thank you very much. It makes me think of the discussion this morning regarding digital process and how effective is that then on the basis of what you're saying. But I'd like to come to the gentleman here, and if you could tell me your name, please, and your question.
Thank you, Lee.
No, sorry, it's you. I'm queuing up the next speaker, please.
Erol Önderoğlu. I'm a correspondent in Turkey of Reporter Without Border. So I think I was able to understand that there is two different approaches. The one much more liberal in the United States, the one which referred Daniel, and the general situation in most of European countries mentioned by Miklos. In Turkey, what I can yes, we should regulate internet sector and extend the area of freedom of expression in online area. But I think that we should first of all refer to the nature. We need a regulation in the nature of the relationship between governments and civil societies first. Can you imagine a country who is more than a candidate for European Union since more than 10 years, which is constantly making reforms? First juridical package, second juridical package, now we are talking about the fourth one. But all these reforms have the aim to remand what was strictly wrong in the past. But just for one reason, because I think that the Turkish situation can be an example to reflect the countries in some Balkan countries and some Asiatic countries, where civil society is not recognized at all. OSCE is meeting with embassies, representatives, officials, and civil society organizations. But in our countries, when it's come to make reform for EU to change the mind, to make a step in a contemporary world, to be in line in European Court of Human Rights decision, etc., civil society does not exist at all. I think that without taking into consideration, without stopping attacking civil society, blaming them to be a part of outlawed organization, and then I think that simple recommendation put on the table by this civil society can, and to refresh this relationship, can be a real step to completely eliminate the differences of vision, which is not so important between European Union and this United States liberal attitude. But we are, as Turkey, as many countries, we are so far from this contemporary approach. That's what I want.
Thank you very much. I'm
Thank you.
going to go to Olaf in a second. Sorry, and to Divi just a second. But just to be clear on the distinction between Europe and the US, I mean, over the last 50 years, the Court of Human Rights has been ruling on cases, over 500 cases on Article 10 of the Convention, which is more and more narrowly circumscribing the interference with that freedom. So it's a different approach to actually making sure that there is freedom from a rule of law perspective. So it's very important to bear that in mind. Olaf first, then Divi, and then we have two comes from the floor.
Well, I think civil society is important, but I would actually say that the thing that makes the difference between a liberal and less liberal constitution on liberty and freedom of expression is whether this right is seen as an individual right and a universal right, not as a collective right. So to a certain extent that excludes the civil society because what is the problem with Turkey is it's an old state-oriented constitution which actually has the aim to protect the state against the individual, to protect the state authority against the individuality and what you need is a constitution that turns things upside down and actually sees the liberties as a protection of the individual against excessive state authority. And I think that is the fundamental thing. And when we discuss internet freedom, I think it's extremely important to note that it's not only a question of having freedom of the internet, it's a question of having the whole kit of the open society, the whole constitutional setup. And a number of countries now starts to recognize that. I found in Kenya that they had a very, very vibrant debate on this particular issue. They said well, we understand it's important to have free media, we understand it's important to have freedom on the internet, but we understand even more that we will not get neither of this if we don't have a constitutional approach which safeguards the individual's rights and liberties as individual rights and liberties.
I think it's very strong in Sweden, isn't it? Divi, you wanted to come in, please, and then we come to the floor.
Yeah, I just want to also react on what both Marco and you just said about the importance of dialogue. I think we should really recognize that we're in the middle of a change here, and what to do with the internet and how to go ahead with freedom of speech, and also in our discussion with some of the countries that are challenging these issues. I think we should really put the dialogue at the center in the sense that we have to trust also the self-regulatory mechanism of a public debate. I mean, it's not trust our own public. You were mentioning this film, Innocence of Muslims. Of course, also in the Netherlands, it steered a lot of debate. But what happened, and I think that is also a role of government, is that a mayor, a Dutch mayor with a Muslim background, he actually got into the debate. He said, listen, this is only a film. You have to laugh about it. It's a provocation, and that's what it is, and it's nothing more. And if you don't agree, why don't you make your own film? And I think in that respect, if you are looking at regulation, well, and this was already mentioned very clearly also by Dan, it has a lot of dangers also because it's very hard to go back. And what we are trying to do now in the Netherlands is also have this dialogue. For example, a Global Network Initiative talked to Dutch companies about how to go ahead. Should there be code of conduct? What way should all these different actors behave? I think that is an issue that is really developing here. And in that respect, we should also take time for this development. I don't think we need to talk about regulation right now. I mean, it's a relatively new situation we're facing, and of course there will be issues. And I mean, we have several cases in the Netherlands. Everyone has examples, but I think it's also part of this whole change that we take that space and see, you know, where it's going.
So combat speech with more speech.
Sorry?
combat speech with more speech. But I don't know whether that actually caters for those vulnerable groups who don't have the ability or are equipped to be on the internet to say what they have to say. So, I mean, I'm thinking about the Roma and the Gypsies in different countries, and how they're not online, I don't think, at least not many of them, I understand. So how do they get their voice heard and have that dialogue? That's the question. We have two comments from the floor.
Yeah.
You please, and your name. Thank you.
I'm Tim Carr. I'm with Free Press. It seems that the context of this discussion is around the idea of regulation as limiting free speech in a context where the threat to free speech is governments and not other entities. This is a conversation we have in the United States around issues like net neutrality, where the threat is not government, out of which a lot of this, the legal framework comes, and that perception, but the threat is increasingly on private platforms where people communicate in the age of high-speed internet access and social media. And so my question is really, is the issue not really to whether to regulate or not, but whom to regulate and for what reasons?
Good question. Does anybody want to, from the floor, take that, Janice? Yes, Marco, please, and we'll come to you after.
I think that's a very good question, and it's a very interesting debate, but we don't have to forget that the reality is that we are facing a world where censorship and legislation trying to block content online are the rule. So the question would be probably also how to protect citizens from a restriction of their freedoms, how to help activists in countries where this freedom is at risk to keep on keeping alive the debate around these things. We are thinking about our friend in Azerbaijan. We had the opportunity to visit Baku for the IGF, and we found shocking that there was not a meaningful debate during the IGF around the situation in Azerbaijan, apart at the session organized by the Council of Europe, US, and the European Commission on media pluralism. So, for example, and again, if you simply look at our services, in 70 countries around the world, YouTube is completely blocked. In 25 countries of the 150 countries where we offer our services, we have problems of censorship. So this means that we need to keep the two debate open. One debate is about what kind of solution we can put in place in order to avoid abuses, avoid things that can create a risk for our society. But at the same time, we need to be crystal clear that censorship, blocking, filtering is not the way forward, and we need to help with on the ground fighting for fundamental rights.
Thank you. Janis Čačić, who to regulate? You want to come in on this point, then we'll go to the floor.
Let me try to this question, whom to regulate, or an earlier question, whether to regulate the internet. I don't think that the question is put correctly here. I don't think it's about regulation. I think that what we are trying to discuss is here is how to treat internet. And I think internet should not be treated only as a medium or a media outlet. It should be treated as something much more than that. It's a space, virtual reality called cyberspace. It's a space. And fortunately, there seems to be an emerging consensus in the world that this virtual reality, this cyberspace, should be treated, as far as freedoms and restrictions are concerned, in the same way as the real world. So the same rules that apply in the real world governing freedom of expression and restrictions thereof should be applied in the cyberspace. That doesn't need much regulation. What it needs is acknowledgement and recognition that the same rules apply online as they do offline. So I think this is partly the answer. Now, what are these rules that apply in real world, offline? Several people already mentioned that the practice in OSCE is not uniform. It is the fact that participating states will give you different answer to your question, where does this freedom of expression end and a crime begins? very different questions, very different answers to this question can be found in various countries. In other words, what is a crime in one country is constitutionally protected free speech or free expression in another country. So there are different realities in the scope of freedom and restrictions. But what we have managed, nevertheless, in OSCE is we have managed to achieve an agreement, consensus of all 57 now states on a large body of commitments governing these issues, from which I think you can take that restrictions to freedom of the expression, or let's be even more precise, criminalization of speech, for instance, should be used sparingly, only in extreme cases, only in cases, for instance, when a speech has as a possible imminent consequence a violence. Then, of course, you can't avoid restricting. Other than that, the OSCE commitments clearly favor allowing speech, even when it is offensive, shocking, disturbing, insulting, and so on, even, let's say, when it is bad. However, there is also consensus that such a speech needs to be countered, for instance, hate speech. Countered, not banned. But countered how? Well, OSCE offers a number of tools how to counter such bad speech through education, through the politicians speaking out against bad speech, if you wish, through promoting diversity, the dialogue, and so on. But again, not to resort to ever growing banning, criminalization, and punishment of what people say or express. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So restraint, a responsibility in being restrained not to do some things. We have a gentleman there who has been waiting, so please, your name. Thank you.
Marcin Cieślak, Polish Wikipedia community. I have something referring to both transparency and rule of law. What we are facing right now, and I think it's a major danger here, is replacement of rule of law, as written in our treaties, with a rule of code or computer code, which takes over and implements various measures, not necessarily written legislation. And I would disagree with Mr. Haraszty that nothing can be done, because, for example, at Wikipedia, we are using certain amount of automated processing to weed out some simple spam or some simple things, like somebody deleting a whole article or something. But Google, Facebook, and different content providers are using much more elaborate technology to analyze what is being submitted, what is being published, and whether it gets through, and so on. And my question, especially to Mr. Pancini, is around the transparency of this proceeding. How, once we are living in an automated world, and we know that code is taking over regulation, and regulation will never catch up with the issues which we are facing every minute, how we can provide that human rights and will be protected, and transparency will be provided when computer code is deciding and is actually right now controlling and gatewaying our speech to the internet and back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the question about freedom without innovation, without freedom of innovation on the internet, and sometimes when someone say that technical side, it's technical, it's difficult to understand, maybe it's not transparent, and the devil's in the details. Marco.
So say that transparency is important because, again, it opens up the way and the possibility for everybody to look into the behavior of companies and comment. On the specific question, I think that, as was said this morning, every kind of deep packet inspection should be seen as something that, first of all, is not in line with the European framework, but also is very, very dangerous. This is why, in the context of the ITU discussion at the weekend, we oppose very strongly together with the other stakeholders from the industry, the major stakeholders from the industry, not all the stakeholders from the industry, towards any proposal in the ITRs going into the direction of allowing through standardization, allowing through telecommunication rules to look into the content that users are exchanging, even if only for security reasons. Security is very important. Security has to be one of the main focus for internet and technological companies, but security has to be at the service of the user, should not be considered at the service of other interested parties on top of the users or without taking in consideration user right. So I agree with you, and as far as we are concerned, we are not going into the direction of offering automatic service to look into user behavior or user communication.
Thank you, Marco. We have 3 comments from the floor. First with Emir, and then we come to this gentleman here, and then to the lady at the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Nemir Polak. I'm from Communication Regulatory Agency from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm also a bureau member of the CDMCI and Council Bureau. I thank you first of all the panelists for the presentation. I have the questions. I would like actually, if we could touch upon a little bit responsibilities within those freedom of expressions. Especially I would like to hear from you, the experience from ESA and also from the EU, what the media literacy has with this. Is this one of the way of the future, how we can actually participate or to do something in regarding of promotion and protection, freedom of expression for the future? Thanks.
Thank you. Olaf, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, first I think it's, even here, one must take the right approach. The right approach, just as in security and as in the constitutional matter, the state should be there to protect freedom and liberties, not to undermine it. And that is the basic formula. It's very easy. If you really understand what it boils down to, then if you have surveillance in an open society, you have it transparent, you have it democratically controlled, and you have the protection against abuse. But in a country which is not open, or a society which is not open, there it is there in order to control the citizens, in order to follow them, in order to see to that they don't do anything that could be endanger the power and the people in power position. And the whole protection of internet and the whole protection, the security issue, must be seen, as I see it, as a way to protect open and free societies. But of course, if you don't have an open and free society, it's a very different story. And I think that when we discuss these issues, we must dare to face the fundamental problem. I'm allowed to let my security guys do things in order to protect my open and free society that I'm not allowed, or that I will not allow the same guys do in an authoritarian or even totalitarian environment. And I think that this is the elephant in the room in the multilateral context. We do not dare to face these fundamental things. And this is something I think we should actually be able to take on.
Sorry, I just want to jump in real quick. I agree that that is an elephant that is often in the room. I think that another way of putting it is that context matters, and having a discussion about one discrete aspect of the way that a government lives up to its responsibilities to protect the rights of its citizens doesn't work, because while you are allowed, in my view as well, to let your security guys do certain things to protect your free society, where I wouldn't support some of the governments of other participating states doing so. The fact is, when you do that, people don't disappear into a black van from their street corner and never get heard from again, whereas they do in some other places, and so the context matters.
Thank you. So it seems to me not one size fits all, actually, Olaf. I'm not sure what, in terms of the issue. Please.
Ali Navruzov from Azerbaijan. As you already said, there are a lot of like problems with territorial jurisdiction, and different countries has different laws, different tradition, and this is a big obstacle for internet freedom. I don't know, maybe my question is more of a philosophical question, but I overheard this in IGF in Baku. There were several people saying that maybe we need a special regime for internet, like a regime for outer space, regime for international waters, and then the special regime for the internet out of all jurisdictions and out of all traditions and all national laws. That's my question. Maybe I wanted to learn your approaches. Thanks.
A special regime for the internet. Anyone want to take that on? From the panel?
I think we do have one, effectively, and it's unlike the way that other things are governed. We have a multi-stakeholder regime that has, oftentimes at these conferences we discuss as if this is the first time anybody's thought about these public policy problems, and the fact is the internet, while it hasn't been around a long time in human history terms, it's been around for a while, and it's been managed, not through a traditional way of managing things, not through an intergovernmental agreement, not through a single government's agreement, but it's been managed through a multi-stakeholder approach, and the old "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" rule that is often used is the one that I think we should use here. So the question, I think, is already answered by the world around us, that problems are identified by strange kinds of collaboration that we couldn't have imagined before the internet, and they're solved that way as well.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go to the back of the room. There are two hands, I think two ladies' hands that I've seen. The lady there, so it's it's there, you there first, please, and then the lady there, sorry. Please, your name.
Catherine Fitzpatrick from New York. Just coming back to the question this gentleman raised about the platforms really are the regime because they're adjudicating millions of cases. And with the Google Transparency Report, we get the aggregate numbers, but what we don't get are the principles by which these cases are adjudicated. We don't know whether, do you use the Copenhagen principles? Do you use, Brandenburg versus Ohio or Lingens versus Austria? We don't know how each case is actually judged and whether, basic principles like the right to face accusers are either enter into the picture. So the other piece of this, to get to what Dan was saying, is that the First Amendment and these sort of model laws or whatever become abstract because the TOS of the companies migrates back to government websites where we don't have the First Amendment at whitehouse.gov. We have a corporate-style TOS. So you have, machine decisions get made. Someone says, if you don't have 150 signatures, you can't show up and search. Or if you don't have 25,000 signatures, you can't get an answer from the executive. Or whoops, we'll move the goalposts, make it 100,000. So all these arbitrary decisions come to play on what is theoretically a space of social media embodying First Amendment or any other speech code. But it's not just code of law, it's the culture of the coders and the corporations, which is an arbitrary one.
And it's not very transparent, I think you're trying to say. Marco Pencini, please.
So I want to stress again the fact that the transparency report is not there only to show that we are doing the right thing. It is actually there to show that what behavior we are taking in consideration to the different situations we are confronted. For example, we are mentioning clearly in the cases there was not the governments didn't follow the rule of law. There was not a duly request that has all the requirements that a request needs to have accordingly to the situation that you described before. We say that in this occasion we didn't reply. We didn't process the request, so we didn't give out the data. We are also mentioning about controversial situation, like for example ECPA. We are mentioning about the situation in which, for example, member state didn't follow the MLAT process, which is the basic process that has to be put in place in order to have a valid request from a state, from a different state than the US. So I strongly encourage you to have a look at the transparency. Yeah. MLAT. So since Google is based in the US, the process in order to send a request to Google is to pass by the multilateral agreement which are put in place in order to allow the communication between different jurisdictions. So the request has to be sent through diplomatic measure and has to be and is processed then accordingly to the MLAT procedure. But this is all explained in the transparency report. So again, we through this exercise we try to make as clear and as clear as we can the process that we are following in order to have a meaningful debate.
Okay, thank you, Marco. Dan, very briefly.
Just very briefly. I mean, I understand your question. I think that it's important to remember that companies do not, companies come under the law. They do not, as such, have an affirmative obligation to permit all forms of content on their platforms. Google, as a matter of business practice, recognizes that if they're in the information business, they have an interest in allowing access to a maximum of information because customers will trust it more if they know that they're not being having information shut off. But I think the more serious concern, which I think is the concern you were raising, is to what extent restrictions that governments would like to impose, in effect, get outsourced to companies through pressure on companies or through reliance on terms of service, which are more restrictive than legislation is. And so the government simply just goes to the company and says, hey, this is inconsistent with your terms of service, and that's not transparent to citizens because they can not have a law as such, but they rely on that. And that step, I think, is an important policy issue to discuss, and frankly, is a temptation that tempts policymakers, I imagine, in all companies. You know, it won't come as any surprise that I've had interesting conversations with my own colleagues about when and whether terms of service violations ought to be relied upon, or whether there ought to be affirmative statements of that are reaffirming the First Amendment. So I think that interplay is the place that's most hidden.
Thank you very much, Dan. We have 15 minutes left, so I need to get through another 1 or 2 questions. You've been very patient.
Rubina Möhring, Reporters Without Borders in Austria. I would like to come back to Mr. Lenarcic. Hopefully I understood you in the right way. The more you forbid, the more people are interested in the forbidden information, let's say. So I myself, I totally agree that you shouldn't forbid information via the internet or control it or repress it. Of course, people have to know and to distinguish what is propaganda and what is information. So parallelly, thinking about how to better the internet, let's take this positive formulation, we should think about as well how to educate even the kids to work with the internet, to understand, to distinguish. That's propaganda, that's rightist or leftist or middleist, I don't know, and that's more or less objective information. I think that's a key point. We should start to think about that, because when people know, and when already kids know, how to interpret the information they get via internet, so they are not in danger to be disinformed. So it's far away from technical questions, it's just a question of education. Point 2, I mean, we live, west of Vienna, we live in a so-called open society. Most of us live in traditional democracies. There's another point, Reporters Without Borders are criticizing quite hardly that German and British companies sell technologies to control population and the internet in they sell these technologies to repressive regimes, and I think that's absolutely let's say, to be criticized, and we we sent our critics to the OSCE, not to the OSCE, but to the OECD, ED, and there we should put an eye on these practices as well. I mean, it brings money, it's fine, but it's absolutely not in the sense of the best let's say, practices in the sense of freedom of expression and freedom of media.
Thank you very much. Before I come to the panel, if they want to respond, Brett, does your comment go in line with that? Okay, then please.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to pick up on the point from Olaf before, and which was confirmed by Dan, around the kind of the democratic nature of, like, the context matters in terms of security. And if we look at, like, some of the laws that are being passed or proposed to be passed in Canada, C30, the cybersecurity strategy here within the European Union, you know, the 1.3 million requests that were made by law enforcement in the United States to telcos. I think it's important that we actually investigate that, and that we properly interrogate that, in the sense that it's not just that internet freedom happens overseas. And I think many of the non-democratic states are very aware of the security legislation provisions, etc., that are being proposed within the democratic states. And there is the case of the kind of the black van appearing in the digital environment. It's just that we don't see it.
Thank you very much. Does anybody of the panel want to come in on the two last comments? Yes, Miklos, please.
I wouldn't like to avoid the questions of responsibility and create the impression that the impossibility of treating the internet as the old media was treated would mean a free fall in terms of responsibility. But the right answer to this quandary is obviously not governmental regulation. That is made impossible by the very new character of the internet, if not by democratic responsibility. But by the, now this is a murky concept, let me specify it in a moment, the internet itself, the internet creators and users itself. In another aspect, Devi very, very rightly alluded to the internet gives actually more possibilities for you to counter bad speech with more speech than old media did. That's one possibility. But let me allude to another one, the concept of self-regulation. And let's admit that one of the embarrassing new characteristics of internet is that it is very fragmented and it is very, very pluralistic, so to say. I mean, it consists of myriads of outlets. And that very concept, especially at the first sight, let's say the first sight of the first decade, the first 15 years of the existence of internet, makes it very difficult to discover elements or to create elements of self-regulation. Now, one thing we could calm worries, both of governments and of audiences who are worried because of the prevalence of bad speech on internet, is to allude to the structure of the old media. The old media, we all know, even without education, without media education, but with the help of media education, we would know better, that the old media consists of, let's be rude, consists of trash and consists of responsible outlets. The club of those who would like to be the outlet of democracy itself, who would like to be responsible, are kind of self-labeling themselves as quality, and they have self-regulation as a response to responsibility. Namely, they don't want to be perfect, but they want to be accountable, and they want to be responsive to the audience. The development of that category, of that club, is much slower in the internet, partly because it's so fragmented, partly because it's so much, partly because you have many, many languages in one space. As Janez put it, it's one space with many, many languages that actually also adds to the problem of American servers and other countries. I'm sure that with American place, upload, American, English language, the approach could be different even in America somewhat. But the main point is you have to, not just please do, but you have to give time for the development of self-regulation on internet. And if not for other reasons than for financial reasons, because it surely bad news again, it will come with paywall. You will meet this self-labeling category of the proud club of quality. And then media education can help to make people understand that you shouldn't expect a perfect world online either. Just like you don't expect a perfect world in the classic media. You will have Zsoltér Gazette, you will have Boulevard, you will have tabloid, you will have online. Right now you have a lot of them, and you are blinded by this embarrassing prevalence of bad speech, but you don't have any better solution than educate people and wait until the club of quality self-regulation emerges online as well.
Thank you, Miklos. We're coming down to our last 5-6 minutes. I know Olaf wants to take the floor, but I'll ask the other panelists to get ready to make some closing remarks and recommendations. You know, where is online speech heading? Online speech heading? Do we do nothing? Do we do less? It's education. It's letting self-regulation flourish. Is there a chilling effect when we think about Wicked? We think about the big discussion there. Indirectly, how does that affect free speech? I mean, I'll put it there anyway. And I'd really like your comments on about upstream prevention of problems downstream regarding violations of freedom of expression online. How can we do things upstream, and how can we deal with violations downstream, and what are those violations? Olaf, that's a lot, sorry.
Thank you. Well, about self-regulation, I mean, let's not forget that social media is about 5 years old, actually. I mean, it's not a decade yet. And we are in a very experimental phase. And we need to be in an experimental phase. And let me remind you about the discussion we had about IPRs and the downloading of files. We all waited for the distributors and the producers to develop new means of marketing, new business models, basically. And it took some time, but now they are here. We have Spotify, for example, for the music. And people are now, authors are now able to take, to charge for their books, etc., e-books, etc. So, we have crowdsourcing, a wonderful new model business model that is appearing. We have a huge battle going on between the IPR community and the open source community on the net. It's a very, very interesting competitive battle. And we don't know who is going to trump the other one, but it's a very, very interesting thing going on, and it is a thing that really gets into the core of many of those issues that we are discussing here today. I strongly believe in self-regulation. We have done it with old media, as was said before, and we have a number of good examples in our history. For example, in Europe and after the Second World War, we had a very, very intensive and very, very interesting and very, very enlightening debate about the difference between journalism and propaganda, for example. The difference between political, what rules should be acceptable in a political debate in order not to let the propaganda rule. And that was a very, very important debate after the totalitarian experiments in Europe. And that was, part of it was actually the founding of the Council of Europe. And I think that Karl Popper is just as valid on the internet as it is in the prints. Just as valid. The whole concept of what is a decent way to argue is still valid. And I see now how some of those chat pages develops the old liberal values on political debates. They are fact-founded, they treat the issue of relevance seriously, they even start now to treat the issue of balance seriously. So I see improvements on those very, very public sites. Improvements that I do not see among the tabloids. in Western Europe. Because they tend to go the other way. They becomes even less serious, while the internet tends to become more serious, if I look at the debates that are there. And then, of course, we must tell our kids that there are things that is not okay to say on the net, just as there are things that is not okay to say in the classroom or in the school. Yes. So it's a combination of things.
Thank you, Olaf. We're really running out of time. Divi, some final remarks, please.
Okay, well, I won't duplicate. I think educating our children is really very important. You just asked before, and I wanted to react on that. What do we do with those communities that do not have access to the internet? How do you make sure that they are being heard? Well, I would like to recommend you all to go see the film High Tech, Low Life, China Digital Times, about two netizens, Zuola and Tiger Temple. And Tiger Temple rides his motorbike through China and gives a voice to those people in small villages that are being harassed in different ways. And I think it is an issue, though. We have to look into those communities that do not have a voice. So that is one of the things that I think I take with me from this discussion, that we have to also look into that. And another remark, actually, Dan, that you made, that we have a multi-stakeholder approach currently that is working quite well. And I think we really should not forget that.
Thank you. Any other final remarks from your panel? Dan, please.
A couple quick points. First, Brett, in response to your comment, I think, first of all, it's true that most governments get some aspects of governing substantively wrong and need to fix things without getting to any specifics of your points. I think one of the reasons why the procedural points that were made this morning are so important is that adherence to those procedural norms allows you to fix substantive concerns. And I think another way of saying that context matters, or perhaps another slice at it, is that procedure matters so that you can make arguments about things and fix them. And I think that shouldn't be lost. Again, granting that all governments make mistakes at any given time, the vehicle for changing that should be present. Real quick, I think we shouldn't lose track of, since this started on questions about offensive speech, we shouldn't lose track of the way that freedom of expression also is connected to other freedoms, particularly freedom of religion and freedom of belief, because one of the justifications for restricting freedom of expression is often that it's offensive in some way to people's religious beliefs. But obviously, minority religious beliefs in particular are often deemed offensive by the majority. And so restrictions on speech that are governed by the majorities being offended are often parts of limitations on the practice or the sharing expression of religious faith. And there's an affirmative role that freedom of expression plays. It's not just that it permits to offend people, it actually permits the basis for people's affirmative exercising of their freedom of religion and belief. Second, I want to say that the other governments on the panel, Sweden and the Netherlands, have both been real leaders in freedom of expression. Sweden led the resolution at the Human Rights Council, which was really a signature achievement last year, and the Dutch launched, with several other partners from OSCE, a Coalition for Freedom Online, which is a group of governments, and we've been proud to be part of that. There's also been an effort in the last couple of years to have a decision in the OSCE, a declaration in the OSCE on fundamental freedoms in the digital age, which is simply put that the same fundamental freedoms that are embodied in the commitments of the OSCE apply online as they do offline. And I would encourage those in civil society in particular who are here to ask their governments if they are co-sponsors of that document. There are 48 of them, and the ones who are left, I think, should answer to the reasons why they are unwilling to affirm their same commitments online as they do offline. Finally, last point is that we shouldn't forget the connections that this issue has to the other dimensions in the OSCE, the connections to an open internet has to economic prosperity, and the connections that an open internet has to good governance and the kinds of things that contribute to security as well.
Thank you very much. From government to business, Marco Pencini, Google. One remark, please. We're out of time. So.
I think it's very, very important to keep remembering that the multi-stakeholder approach is the only possible approach to discuss about these kind of issues. So it's very important to keep alive the debate and the dialogue on how to tackle this kind of situation. It's very, very important to have a shared also to share some important values like the defense of fundamental rights. Out of this, I think we are going into direction that are not healthy for the development of an open internet.
Inclusive, open, transparent dialogue. Miklas has promised me a very short remark. Miklas, a very short remark, because we have to close now.
Okay. I just want to reiterate the slogan of the representative freedom of the media office's main line, which Dunja carries out so perfectly, which is that only, just like in old media, new media too, only a perfectly free media can be fully responsible. Many countries are coming from a non-democratic past. Many countries in the OSCE are post-dictatorial democracies, and all dictatorships in the old time and new deteriorations of democracy too work under the slogan, under the banner of bettering, perfecting, correcting the media. We know that that's possible only under freedom, and even then not fully. So let's keep to that basic rule. Otherwise, we go into a new utopia of a perfect media, which only ends up in an unfree media.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists, great panelists, for all your interventions. Thank you to you for coming. I'd like to close there and keep on talking. Thank you.